The walls that protected Europe for 1,000 years were gone. 3 years after reducing Constantinople to ash, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror was marching north. He didn't just want another city, he wanted to march his undefeated army straight to Rome. His immediate target was the fortress of Belgrade, the final lock on the door to Europe. If it broke, the continent would be flooded. A wave of paralyzing terror swept through the courts of Christendom. The kings of Europe froze. They refused to send their royal armies. They refused to send their heavy cavalry. To stop the most technologically advanced military machine on the planet, the defense of Europe fell to a single hardened warlord named John Hunyadi and a feral mob of peasants.
Mehmed arrived with 100,000 men. He brought a massive river fleet to choke off the Danube. Most terrifying of all, he dragged the heavy bronze siege cannons, the exact same artillery that had just shattered the Byzantine Empire. Hunyadi had only a fraction of those numbers. His professional corps was dangerously small. The rest of his men were farmers, monks, and minor nobles, whipped into a crusading frenzy by a radical friar. They carried rusted swords, pitchforks, and slings. By every metric of warfare, this was a slaughter waiting to happen. An army of dirt-poor farmers was preparing to face the Ottoman elite. The bombardment began with overwhelming violence. Day and night, the heavy artillery pounded the European fortifications to dust. The Ottoman fleet locked down the river, cutting off all hope of escape. Knowing a static defense was suicide, Hunyadi mounted a desperate, violent naval counterattack. Pushing a makeshift fleet of small boats down the river, the Europeans crashed straight into the Ottoman blockade. Through sheer chaotic aggression, they shattered the naval line. It bought the exhausted defenders just enough time to brace for the final assault. But stone can only take so much. After weeks of relentless cannon fire, the outer defenses of Belgrade collapsed entirely. The fortress was open. Mehmed unleashed the Janissaries. These were the elite, heavily armored, undefeated shock troops trained from childhood for one single purpose: absolute destruction. They poured into the breached city, their war drums echoing through the ruins, expecting an easy massacre of a broken garrison. But the Europeans had laid a trap. Hunyadi knew his men would be butchered in an open field, so he ordered his forces to fall back into the shadows. He deliberately allowed the elite Ottoman infantry to flood deep into the narrow, labyrinthian streets of the lower city. The Janissaries pushed forward, confident the fortress was theirs. Once the Ottoman elite were packed tightly inside the claustrophobic streets, the trap slammed shut. From the upper walls and rooftops, the European defenders unleashed hell. They hurled down blazing wood, boiling pitch, sulfur, and oil-soaked rags. They ignited the very streets. A massive wall of fire erupted behind the Janissaries, cutting off their retreat and sealing them inside. The hunters suddenly became the hunted. Trapped in the burning, choked streets, the invincible Ottoman infantry was entirely isolated. In the brutal hand-to-hand slaughter that followed, the European defenders systematically annihilated the trapped Janissaries. The elite corps of Mehmed's army was massacred in the fire. The next morning, the impossible happened. Despite strict orders to hold their defensive positions, a handful of European peasants wandered out of the ruined fortress. They began trading insults and arrows with the surviving Ottoman lines. What started as an unauthorized skirmish rapidly spiraled into absolute madness. More and more of the peasant militia rushed out to join the fight. The sheer feral aggression of the European mob completely overwhelmed military discipline on both sides. A massive, chaotic, and totally uncontrolled counteroffensive crashed directly into the Ottoman siege camp. The Ottoman army, still reeling from the catastrophic loss of their elite infantry in the fire, was caught completely off guard. The lines snapped. The fighting grew so desperate that Sultan Mehmed himself was forced into the hand-to-hand slaughter, fighting until he was struck by an arrow and badly wounded.
With their sultan bleeding and their camp overrun by screaming peasants, the unbeatable Ottoman war machine shattered. Panic swept through their ranks. They broke formation, abandoned their dead, left their massive siege cannons sinking in the mud, and fled into the night. The victory was absolute. The relief across Europe was so profound that the Pope ordered every church bell on the continent to ring at noon, a tradition that continues to this very day. Against impossible odds, a crumbling fortress and an army of farmers broke the conqueror of Constantinople, halting the Ottoman invasion of Europe for 70 years. History is rarely poetic, but it is always brutal.